Hello, Dr. Peterson. So, a lot of your work, a lot of your lectures recommend the audience tackle life with a lot of attention and intention. And, in my kind of personal gateway drug to philosophy has been more Eastern philosophy, and like the Bhagavad Gita and the work of Alan Watts and Taoism. And what I noticed, I may be wrong, but this is a common theme in Eastern philosophy, which is more passive, non-action, don't make as many plans. I wonder how you reconcile that and how you are reconciling that, because you mentioned earlier in previous lectures that you've read the Tao Te Ching. How do you reconcile those two different views?
So the questioner asks about three specific references. He says the Bhagavad Gita, he says Alan Watts, he says the Tao Te Ching. So these three approaches are totally distinct and unique. They're not necessarily pointing to the same primary approach. Jordan Peterson doesn't talk about the Bhagavad Gita or about Alan Watts in his response. And he goes into the Tao Te Ching because that's what he knows out of the three, I'm assuming. Maybe he knows a lot about the Bhagavad Gita, but it doesn't seem like he wanted to tackle that, at least. We'd have to find out. I mean, I've only seen one other instance of somebody mentioning the Bhagavad Gita, and even there, he didn't seem like he had that much to say about it. So I'm going to assume that he doesn't know about the Bhagavad Gita as well as he knows about the Bible, which is, probably a normal likelihood because he's a Westerner, grew up in Canada, and unless he was raised by parents that introduced him to the Bhagavad Gita or got into the Hindu philosophies at a young age and has been studying it up until the present, he's probably not that immersed in the Bhagavad Gita. But the Tao Te Ching, he seems like he's put as much energy into that as possibly that he has into the biblical stories.
Well, I think first that the Tao Te Ching in particular isn't about inaction. It's about minimal proper action. And it's also about minimal proper action after a tremendous amount of sacrifice. Right? So the sage that's speaking forth in the Tao Te Ching has already let go of almost everything that he needs to let go of. And a tremendous amount of what you're reading in the Eastern philosophies is predicated, I think, at least in part, on the idea of sacrifice.
So he references the Eastern philosophies at this point. That's a huge body of work with billions of different people, and Eastern, I mean, are we talking about Buddhism? Are we talking Tibetan Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism? Are we talking about Hinduism? Are we talking about Shaivitism, Vaishnavitism, Vedanta? Are we talking about the Vedas? Are we talking about all of the various different well-known commentators on the different Indian texts, like Shankara? Are we talking about Zen Buddhism? I mean, there's so much to Eastern philosophy that it's kind of hard to just say summarize Eastern philosophy. I mean, I totally agree with what he says about the Tao Te Ching, but I disagree with trying to use that as a representation for all of Eastern philosophy.
There's lots of things that you're grabbing onto, like the monkey, with the jar, that's actually causing your misery. And so sometimes letting go is the right way of moving ahead. But to me, that ties into this idea of sacrifice. So now whether there's more than that, whether there's more intentionality in Western philosophy and less intentionality in Eastern philosophy, I'm not exactly sure.
I've read a lot more from what he's referring to as Eastern philosophy, and than I have about Western religion. And the specific area that I've looked into the most is what's called Advaita Vedanta. And in the presentation of Advaita Vedanta through written texts and also through teachers giving talks about it, there's a complete emphasis on the fact that a human being is not the doer of their actions. That this idea that we're a separate individual human being that has volition and has autonomy and therefore has intention is not reality. And unless that's conveyed in the West, or I guess he's referencing the Judeo-Christian belief structures or systems of thought, then I'm sure it's in there, but it's not as overt, it's not as obvious. But as far as the Bhagavad Gita, as far as the Ribu Gita, the Avadut, the Ashtakavara Gita, it's all about non-intentionality. It's all about realizing and seeing through the illusion that one is a doer of action, because it's like taking credit for the sun, the sunlight, and the water that produces a plant. Well, I water the plant with a hose, and I think that I'm making the plant grow, when I didn't do anything as a person about the sun shining. So how could I take credit for that action? So that's the idea.
One way of mediating between those two was formulated, at least in part, by Carl Jung. Now, he pointed out that the archetypal figure for the West died at 32. And so to some degree, the outgoing, extroverted, let's say, nature of the West is a consequence of its youthfulness, in some sense, its useful ethos. And that the East, I mean, Buddha died at a fairly ripe old age. And even in the Hindu practices, if I remember correctly, in many Hindu temples, there's a lot of erotic sculptures. An idea is something like, if you can't get past the damn erotic sculptures, it's not time to go into the temple. But it's more than that. It might also be that if you're young, it's not time to get past the erotic sculptures. So maybe there's a moving forward into life in youth and a letting go in the latter part of life. And that was Jung's way of mediating between those two traditions.
He's talking about the Buddha. First, he's talking about Jesus dying at 32. I thought it was 33, but anyway. Then he's talking about the Buddha living to be old, and then he's talking about Hinduism and imagery of temples in Hindu traditions. So again, it's kind of jumping around, and he's actually referencing Carl Jung's interpretation of how Carl Jung mediates these traditions. So that means that he's probably getting his information from Carl Jung, not from actually delving into Buddhism or Hinduism. And again, to delve into Buddhism there's so many different paths in Buddhism, and then in Hinduism there's probably even more. Now, what I like about what he's saying is that from my own personal experience, coming into these Eastern teachings, specifically Advaita Vedanta, when I was young, at the age of like 20, well, let's say 21, 22, really getting more interested in them. it is a difficult path for a Westerner to adopt the teachings of Advaita Vedanta as a young person in the world who's planning or already starting a family, because in order to do the things necessary as a human being in the world, like working to provide food and shelter, and especially if you have kids or are about to have kids, it's a good idea what he's saying. You wait until you're older before you dive into this letting go. And while you're young, you're actually going out into the world in action. So it's an interesting emphasis. I don't think that that's the message at all of Eastern philosophy. I mean, the Buddha was very young when he left the palace and materialism and went in search of the truth and for enlightenment. And many of the well-respected and well-regarded gurus and teachers and writers of India were very young. Shankara was, I think, 8 years old when he left his mother and went out into the world and started winning debates against all the pundits and scholars. Of course, Shankara is an extreme example, but then again, so is Jesus. I mean, anyway, there's a lot of really amazing teachers in India that left their life when they were young. Yogananda, who is well known in America for the Self-Realization Fellowship, was probably about 20 or so when he kind of left the normal worldly action. Vivekananda was probably 20. He had just graduated college, so maybe he was 22. Ramana was 16 when he left home in search of the truth, not so much in search, but to make his life an embodiment of an expression of self-realization, and no longer go to school and do the worldly thing. He was 16. There's many, many others, and it's quite common. It's even in some of the literature that self-realization is best approached by a young, healthy human being, not an older person, because they already have so much conditioning and they're dealing with illnesses. And so it's the young sage that kind of is the epitome in the, at least in some of the traditions that I've studied in the East.
I think they're tightly aligned with regards to the importance of sacrifice. It frequently is the case that it's your desire, Maya, let's say, your desire, that's causing your suffering, right? And so there's an emphasis in Buddhism, even more than in Taoism, I would say, on letting go of what's making you miserable. But you remember, the thing about Buddha is that he got enlightened under the Bo tree, right? He basically stepped into the city of God. He stepped into nirvana, and he could have stayed there. But he chose to come back because he decided that he had a responsibility to rectify suffering in the rest of the world, that it was not sufficient for him to be enlightened while everything else was left in a state of insufficiency and suffering.
I think it's similar to what Jesus went through in the desert, where he says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." He's being offered all this worldly power, and that's part of his kind of final test, so to speak, to becoming self-realized. He doesn't have any interest in that worldly power. He doesn't have any interest in riches and women and all of the things that we associate with worldly riches and power. And so the Buddha has a similar experience where he's being given this insight into this world of power and wealth and riches, and he's already left that. You see, he was born into that, so it's not a big deal for him to not be tempted by that. He's already struggled very hard, and his enlightenment is after, I think, 7 years of having fasted and done all kinds of crazy discipline, and he's finally now come to an effortless place where he realizes the deeper truth of nature and of his own infinite presence as consciousness or beingness, not as an individual single human being. So the notion that he's now coming back down to help with the suffering is not the way I would present it. He's not. It's not that he's coming back into the world. It's that he's realized who he is. His body is still in the world. He wasn't dying in that experience. So now that he has many years left to live out his natural life until old age, he's going to spread the Dharma. He's going to give lectures. He's going to give teachings to help seekers to find enlightenment, to realize the middle path, and that they don't have to do all of these crazy disciplines. They simply have to live in a balanced way. And that's most of the Western Buddhism that we have, and that those of us that are monks, if we've studied Buddhism, these are the teachings, the middle way.
And so I wouldn't call that inaction,
It's I've made the mistake myself. It's inaction versus non-action. I actually had to look up non-action.
Yes, that's good. The Tao Te Ching does a very good job of distinguishing between those two, because non-action is the minimal necessary action to keep the balance between order and chaos proper, right?
Okay, so the questioner makes the distinction between inaction and non-action. So the idea there would be that being inactive is relative to being active. And so if you're inactive, you're just laying around, you're not doing anything. And non-action, he says, is the minimal force of action. I would say that non-action is actually the realization that while action is taking place, you are not the personal doer of action. It doesn't matter how much activity is happening. The Buddha could give a 4-hour lecture every day, and he could write a chapter, and he could be busy for 16 hours a day. Or in modern times, let's look at Amma. She gives lectures, she sings, she talks, she gives hugs to thousands of people for like 18 hours of the day. That's a lot of action, but it's being done without any sense of her being the doer, if she's a realized being. And so she's actually in a state of non-action, which means there's no thought, there's no separative thinking, there's no egoic identity. Action is happening, and it's that kind of action which is actually stemming out of that non-doership and that non-action of the mind, which is what's really alleviating suffering. What Jordan Peterson is emphasizing, I think, is his attempt to project a Western ideology onto this idea of non-action. And so now you'll hear the example he uses, which again, it's all practical wisdom. It's just that he's not getting to the depths of what these Eastern teachings offer as far as what non-action is really about.
The yin and the yang. And the Tao Te Ching is very, very emphatic about this. You detach and you watch. And when it's time to intervene, you intervene minimally, without a lot of arrogant self-propagandization, and you tap. And if you do that properly, you hardly have to do it at all. And it's as if you're doing nothing. And there's great wisdom in that book. I really like the Tao Te Ching. It's a remarkable document.
So again, now he's clearly stating it, that he's referring to the Tao Te Ching, not to Buddhism. Maybe he's kind of combining Buddhism with the Tao Te Ching, or seeing the Tao Te Ching as representative of the same philosophy that Buddhism is. I'm not sure. I've read the Tao Te Ching. I've enjoyed it very much. I've not studied it. I've not gone deep into it. I've read it once, and then I've read some quotes here and there. I've not tried to apply any specific teachings from the Tao Te Ching. My main sense, though, is that it's a way of moving in the world and also using martial arts that is very intelligent and wise. But to me, it's not an expression of self-realization or a teaching like Advaita Vedanta that points to what non-duality is and non-doership. And the Bhagavad Gita actually does. So if he were to give an answer specifically about the Bhagavad Gita, I would love to hear that, because that would be a totally different conversation than the Tao Te Ching. So this is my challenge to Dr. Peterson. Could you do a video about the Bhagavad Gita?